In 1771, the most authoritative encyclopedia in the world described it as a present reality. By 1823, it was gone. No war, no conquest, no record of its ending. An empire larger than Rome, documented for 2 centuries by the most credible cartographers in Western history. And then, silence. The empire was called Tartaria, and it didn't disappear because it fell. It disappeared because someone decided it should. The maps still exist. The buildings it left behind still stand. The evidence was never destroyed. It was just never explained. Because you don't need a secret society to erase a civilization. You just need power. And the patience to let silence do the work. But history has a way of leaving behind traces. Traces that don't fit the story we were told. Go to any major library in Europe. Find an atlas from the 17th or 18th century. Open it to Central Asia. You will see it, right there, printed in bold. Grand Tartary, Tartaria Magna, the Great Tartarian Empire. On the maps of Joan Blaeu, the most celebrated cartographer of the 17th century, official mapmaker to the Dutch East India Company, Tartaria occupies the entire northern and central mass of Asia, from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific coastline, from the Arctic tundra to the borders of Persia and China. A territory so immense, it dwarfs every other political entity on the planet at the time. This is not a vague geographical label. This is not the kind of name you scribble over territory you don't understand. Blaeu's Atlas Major, published in 1662, identifies distinct regions within Tartaria. Muscovite Tartary, Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary. It names cities, rivers, administrative boundaries, and ruling peoples. It draws internal borders with confidence. The level of detail is the level you apply to real political entities, to places with governments, with populations, with tax collectors and armies and courts of law. And Blaeu was not alone. Guillaume de Lille, the French royal cartographer, drew it. Vincenzo Coronelli, the official cosmographer of the Republic of Venice, drew it. Herman Moll, the leading British cartographer of the early 18th century, drew it. These were not romantics or fantasists. These were the most rigorous geographical minds of their era. Men whose maps were used by navies, trading companies, and heads of state to make decisions that changed the world. Their work was not art. It was intelligence product. Errors had consequences. Inaccuracies cost fortunes and lives.
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
The Dutch East India Company used Blaeu's charts to navigate trade routes worth more than most kingdoms combined. When those charts showed Tartaria, with subdivisions, with named rivers, with identifiable population centers, that information had been verified by agents in the field, by merchants who traveled those roads, by diplomats who reported back to Amsterdam, to Paris, to London. This was not cartographic decoration. In 1771, the first edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, the most authoritative reference work in the English language, dedicated a full entry to Tartary. It described a vast country in the northern parts of Asia, bounded by Siberia to the north and west. It listed the geography, the climate, the peoples, not as legend, not as myth, as present, documented, existing reality. The kind of entry you write about a place that is there right now as your pen moves across the page. Something was there, something real and large and documented by the most credible institutions in Western civilization for over 200 years. And then, something happened to it. That is the anomaly. Not the appearance on the maps. Any name can appear on a map. The anomaly is the precision, the consistency. The agreement across dozens of independent cartographers working from independent sources across 2 full centuries. You do not get that level of confirmation from a fiction. You do not get administrative subdivisions and named river systems and distinct regional populations from a collective hallucination. And then, in the span of a single generation, it was gone. No conquest recorded. No formal dissolution. No treaty of surrender signed in any European capital. By the early 19th century, the word Tartary had faded from the maps entirely, replaced by the familiar patchwork of territories and khanates we recognize today. The transition looks seamless on the surface, but underneath there is no mechanism. No documented chain of events connecting the enormous, precisely drawn Tartaria of 1771 to its complete absence 50 years later. Something was lost. An empire confirmed by 2 centuries of the most credible sources in the Western world. And the strangest part is this: nobody asked where it went. But history has a way of leaving behind traces that don't fit the story we were told. Here is what you were taught. The word Tartary, your textbooks explain, was simply a catch-all term, a geographical placeholder. Medieval and early modern Europeans didn't really know what was out there beyond Russia and China, so they labeled it. They called the unknown East Tartaria, derived, scholars say, from the Tatar peoples who roamed the steppes, and filled the blank space with a word instead of knowledge. A convenient name for inconvenient ignorance. That's the official version. Clean, rational, respectable. It goes like this. The Mongol Empire of Genghis Khan swept across Asia in the 13th century, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. After it fragmented, various successor states emerged: the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, the Ilkhanate. These were gradually absorbed or displaced by the expanding Russian Empire under the Romanovs, who methodically pushed east across Siberia between the 16th and 18th centuries. By the time the Encyclopaedia Britannica was published in 1771, Russia had already claimed most of northern Asia. What the old maps called Tartaria was simply lands that Russian administrators had not yet formally catalogued and named. When they finished the cataloging, the placeholder became unnecessary. The word Tartaria quietly retired. No drama, no mystery, no conspiracy, no erasure. Just the natural evolution of geographical vocabulary as knowledge replaced ignorance. This is the story that academic geography departments teach without question. This is what history syllabuses accept as settled. This is the version that has gone unchallenged in mainstream scholarship for more than 2 centuries. And in broad outline, it sounds entirely reasonable. It has the shape of a satisfying explanation. It accounts for the appearance of the name, explains its disappearance, and requires no inconvenient follow-up questions. It is a perfect narrative, polished, respectable. The problem is the details. If Tartaria was genuinely just a label for geographical ignorance, a word Europeans used because they didn't know what was really there, then you would expect the maps to reflect that ignorance. You would expect vague outlines, approximate borders, the kind of tentative, hedging cartography that honest mapmakers use when they are filling in blanks. You would expect disclaimers and question marks and the visual language of uncertainty. Instead, the maps are precise. The borders are drawn with the same confidence applied to France or Spain. The internal regions carry specific names and specific boundaries. The population groups are identified and located. The rivers are named and traced. Blau's Atlas Meyer does not treat Tartaria the way mapmakers treated unexplored ocean, with sea monsters and empty space. It treats Tartaria the way it treats every other documented political reality of the 17th century. You do not produce that kind of map from ignorance. You produce it from information. And then there is the deeper problem, the one the official version quietly sidesteps. The Russian expansion eastward across Siberia was not a peaceful administrative exercise. It was not a surveying expedition. It was a war. A long, brutal, generation-spanning campaign of conquest that stretched across more than a century. There were battles. There were sieges. There were Cossack raids and indigenous resistance and mass displacement of populations. Entire peoples were subjugated. Fortresses were built to hold newly conquered territory. Tribute was extracted at gunpoint. Wars leave records. Conquests generate documentation, campaign maps, records of surrenders, inventories of annexed territories, treaties imposed on defeated peoples, correspondence between commanders and the imperial court in Moscow. The Russian Empire was a bureaucratic state. It kept records of everything. So if Russia spent 2 centuries militarily conquering the lands that the old maps called Tartaria, lands belonging to a vast, organized, clearly documented political entity, where is the paperwork? The official story says the question doesn't need answering. The official story says there was nothing there to conquer. But the maps say otherwise. And the maps were made by the people who were selling those trade routes to the highest bidder. The official records say one thing. The evidence says something else entirely. In the 18th century, the Russian Imperial Academy of Sciences dispatched a historian named Gerhard Friedrich Müller to Siberia. His mission was official, sanctioned at the highest levels of the imperial court. His task was straightforward: travel east, consult the local archives, and document the history of Russia's territorial expansion across the continent. He was the empire's own man, sent by the empire to write the empire's story. A loyal servant doing exactly what he was told. He traveled for 10 years. He visited monasteries, administrative outposts, and regional archives scattered across the entire breadth of Siberia. He collected manuscripts. He interviewed local officials and community elders. He compiled what should have been a triumphant account of Russian civilization bringing order and governance to the eastern wilderness. What he found disturbed the people who sent him. Müller's Siberian history, completed in the 1750s, contained references that did not fit the approved narrative. Political structures in regions that official records described as uninhabited wilderness before Russian arrival. Ruling dynasties in territories that were supposed to have had none. Administrative systems with roots going back generations in areas where, according to the story Moscow wanted told, there had been nothing but scattered nomadic tribes waiting to be civilized by a superior power. He wasn't describing nomadic chaos. He was describing organized governance, settled institutions, a history that predated the Cossacks by generations, a history that had no place in the story the empire was building about itself. The Russian imperial government was not pleased. Müller's work was suppressed. Portions were withheld from publication entirely. The documents he had collected, primary sources, local manuscripts, administrative records gathered from across Siberia at great effort and expense, were absorbed into imperial archives, where many of them remained inaccessible for generations. Müller himself was formally reprimanded, stripped of certain academic privileges, and placed under a cloud of official disapproval before eventually being reinstated years later. Think carefully about what that sequence of events means. The empire sent its own officially appointed historian to document its own history. And when he came back with what he actually found, they punished him for it. They buried the documents. They silenced the man. That is a crack. Not proof of a sweeping conspiracy. Not evidence of a single coordinated plan to erase an entire civilization from memory. But it is clear, documented evidence that what Müller found was inconvenient, that the history of Central Asia was being actively shaped by those in power, and that what didn't fit the approved shape was being quietly removed from public circulation. Now here is the second crack, and this one you can see with your own eyes. In cities across Russia and Central Asia, cities that official records describe as having been founded by Russian settlers in the 17th and 18th centuries, there are buildings that do not match their supposed age. Structures with architectural characteristics that predate the dates assigned to them by generations. Colonnaded facades on buildings supposedly thrown up as rough frontier outposts. Vaulted stone foundations beneath structures that colonial records describe as newly built. Construction techniques and proportional systems that were not part of Russian settler tradition and have no plausible origin in the history officially assigned to those locations. In Kazan, in Tobolsk, in Omsk, in Tomsk. City after city across the former Tartarian territories, buildings that the records say were built by Russian colonists display the structural signatures of something far older and far more sophisticated than a colonial outpost. Russian architectural historians have noted this. It appears in regional academic literature. It has never been satisfactorily explained within the framework of the official historical record. The stone does not lie, and the stone does not match the story. We aren't just looking at a mistake anymore. We are looking at a pattern.
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
In 1662, Joan Blaeu published the Atlas Major, at the time the most expensive book ever produced in Europe. 17 volumes, commissioned by the Dutch East India Company, dedicated to European royalty, the definitive geographical authority of its age. Volume 10 covers Asia, and in it, Tartaria is not a blank expanse with a convenient label. It carries the full cartographic vocabulary of a known, functioning political entity. Internal borders, administrative subdivisions, named cities, identified population groups. The same treatment given to France, to Spain, to the Ottoman Empire. Blau's sources were the intelligence reports, merchant accounts, and diplomatic dispatches flowing through Amsterdam, then the commercial and informational center of the world. The Dutch East India Company had agents operating across Asia. They sent back detailed field reports. Blaeu synthesized that information into maps that guided the most powerful trading fleets on Earth. Maps that determined where fortunes were made and where ships were sent. This was not a decorative exercise. This was intelligence product at the highest level of institutional credibility available in the 17th century. When the Atlas Major shows Tartaria with subdivisions, named rivers, and distinct regional populations, that reflects verified information from people who were physically there. Merchants, diplomats, company agents with financial stakes in accuracy. And yet the entity documented with such precision has no clear corresponding place in the political history of Asia that modern historians recognize. No name, no successor state, no acknowledged legacy. This is the first piece of the puzzle. The most credible cartographic institution of the 17th century documented a vast, organized Tartaria. And mainstream history has never explained, in precise terms, what it actually was. And this is where it gets interesting, because it is not just the maps, it is the architecture. Across Central Asia and Siberia, there is a category of buildings that share a striking and unexplained characteristic. They display a consistent architectural vocabulary, specific vault types, recurring proportional systems in facade composition, a particular approach to foundation depth and wall construction, appearing in cities separated by thousands of kilometers, in territories that official history says were never unified under a single political authority. This uniformity has been observed and documented by researchers at Russian regional universities studying pre-Romanov settlement patterns. The buildings range from what appear to be administrative structures to civic halls of considerable scale. Many exist beneath or behind later construction. Many were repurposed by Russian colonial administrators and quietly assigned new founding dates, dates that don't match the physical evidence beneath their foundations. The pattern is exactly what you would expect if a single civilization had built consistently across a large territory using shared standards. The way Roman construction is immediately recognizable from Britain to Syria, because it came from one organized source with one set of rules. The architecture scattered across the former Tartarian territories follows the same logic, a logic of unified origin. This is not theory. This is observable, physical evidence, documented in academic literature, unresolved within the official historical framework. The maps point to something real. The suppressed archives point to something real. And now, the buildings themselves point to the same conclusion. The first piece fits. The second piece fits. And when two pieces fit, you look for a third. Here is the most unsettling part. In 1771, the Encyclopaedia Britannica described Tartary as a present reality, a vast, existing country, named, mapped, described in confident, precise terms by the most authoritative reference institution in the world. By 1823, it did not exist. 50 years. No war declared. No emperor deposed. No capital burned. No treaty of dissolution signed in any European chancellery. No Russian military campaign against a unified Tartarian state appears anywhere in the campaign histories of the Romanov dynasty. No dispatch from a victorious general. No record of a final battle. No moment of surrender. An entity that occupied a third of the Earth's landmass, gone, in 50 years, without a single record of its ending. Think about what that means. Empires do not disappear quietly. The fall of Rome took centuries and filled thousands of volumes of documentation. The dissolution of the Mongol Empire generated centuries of scholarship across multiple continents. Every major political transformation in human history leaves behind an archive of its own destruction. The correspondence, the treaties, the first-hand accounts of the moment power changed hands. Tartaria left nothing. Either it was never real, in which case, explain the Atlas Major, explain the Encyclopaedia Britannica, explain 2 centuries of independent cartographers working from verified commercial intelligence. Or, something happened that someone made a deliberate decision should not be recorded. Those are the only 2 options on the table. There is no comfortable third. Silence is not the absence of evidence. Sometimes, silence is the most important evidence of all. You might think this is a problem of the past, a question about old maps and older empires, something to be argued over by historians in dusty conference rooms with no real bearing on the world you live in today. Ancient geography, settled questions, nothing to do with you. You would be wrong, because the story of Tartaria is not really about Tartaria. It is about who controls the past, and about what happens to the present, to real people, in real places right now, when that control is exercised without accountability and without challenge. The territories once labeled Tartaria are today divided between Russia, China, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and several other nations. These are not stable, peaceful places frozen in time. They are regions of ongoing and often violent geopolitical contest. Territories over which Russia and China have competed for influence for generations, over which energy infrastructure and pipeline politics are actively fought today, over which ethnic and cultural identity is suppressed or amplified according to whoever holds power at any given moment, and whatever story serves them best. The peoples of these regions, The Tatars, the Kazakhs, the Bashkirs, the Siberian indigenous nations have spent centuries being told that their history begins with Russian conquest. That before the Cossacks arrived, there was nothing worth remembering. Wilderness, nomadic disorder waiting to be shaped by a more civilized hand. Their past, in the official version, is a blank space, a placeholder. Exactly the way Tartaria itself was reframed, from a documented reality to a convenient nothing. That is not history. That is a political statement wearing history's clothes, and it has consequences that are still unfolding today. When the Russian government restricts access to the archives that Müller consulted in the 18th century, it is not protecting historical curiosity. It is maintaining a version of the past that justifies a version of the present. The narrative that Central Asia was empty before Russia arrived is the same narrative that makes Russian territorial claims in those regions feel natural and inevitable, rather than imposed, contested, and constructed on a deliberately incomplete record that excluded the evidence the moment the evidence became inconvenient. This is how historical erasure operates in practice. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a manifesto or an official decree. It comes quietly, as a slow de-emphasis, a relabeling, a gradual replacement of one large, meaningful word with 100 smaller words that together add up to less than what they replaced. And by the time anyone notices, the generation that might have challenged it is gone. The next generation has never heard the name at all. The erasure is complete. Not because it was violently enforced, but because it became invisible. Because the silence became the background noise everyone stopped hearing. The question of Tartaria is ultimately a question about the reliability of the history we accept as settled. The Encyclopaedia Britannica of 1771 was the most authoritative reference work in the English-speaking world. Joan Blaeu was the most credible cartographer of his era. Gerhard Friedrich Müller was the official historian of the Russian Empire. These were not fringe voices operating at the margins of knowledge. These were the mainstream institutions of their time, the sources that educated governments, guided commerce, and shaped how entire civilizations understood the geography of the world around them. And they documented something that the mainstream institutions of our time have decided not to explain. If the most credible sources of one era can be quietly set aside by the next, without explanation, without accountability, without even an acknowledgement that something has been lost, then what exactly is the value of the credibility you assign to the sources you trust today? We are still living in the shadow of this decision. We just stopped noticing the darkness. The honest answer to the question in this video's title, Tartaria, Fact or Fiction, is this. The maps are real. The encyclopedia entries are real. The cartographers were real, credible, and working from genuine field intelligence gathered by agents with financial stakes in accuracy. The suppression of Müller's work is real. The architectural anomalies are real. Something was there. Something large, something organized, something that 2 centuries of the most authoritative institutions in Western civilization treated as an existing, documented reality. What exactly it was, whether a unified empire with a central government, a loose confederation of related cultures, or a series of interconnected political entities that outside observers read as a single coherent whole, that remains genuinely uncertain. Serious historians debate it. The evidence is fragmentary, partly because the question has never been systematically and openly investigated, partly because